Are you a retiree worried about meeting your monthly needs as well as having enough to make it through retirement? Inflation. It's that sneaky force that makes your dollar shrink without you even realizing it. Ever notice how groceries cost more than they used to, or that favorite restaurant isn't as affordable as it was last year? That's inflation at work. In today's episode, we're diving into what is inflation and, most importantly, how it can impact your retirement if you're not prepared. Stick around because protecting your savings from inflation is more important than it ever has. Welcome to Retirement Rescue Weekly, where we throw a lifeline to your financial future. This podcast is dedicated to helping rescue retirees from potential dangers that appear in retirement. I'm Kurt Arnold, your host and financial advocate. I'll guide you through the stormy seas of retirement. We'll tackle inflation, taxation, market volatility, and healthcare costs. Together, we'll secure your retirement. Tune in and start your rescue mission today. All right, well, welcome to today's episode of Retirement Rescue Weekly, where we like to help rescue retirees from the different pitfalls that can impact you in retirement and make you have extra worry and concern than you should. I'm Kurt Arnold. I'm a financial planner, financial advocate, and host, and I am passionate about helping people rescue themselves from certain things in retirement. Today's episode, inflation, hits home really hard too. I've had a lot of clients, especially the last few years, post-pandemic, be really impacted with inflation, where their income is not comfortably meeting their needs. Things are really tight. They're worried about other costs increasing, and that's causing a lot of anxiety and fear for them. So we're going to talk about why it's so important to talk about inflation and how to prepare for it. So let's get into today's show. So today's show is inflation erosion, protecting your retirement savings now. Now, let's start with a fun quote. It's by a ball player, Sam Ewing, who was a designated hitter with the Toronto Blue Jays. It's actually one of my favorite quotes when it comes to inflation, as he says, inflation is when you pay $15 for the $10 haircut that you used to get for $5 when you had hair. And I think we can all get a good chuckle from that, as we can tell over time, things keep getting more expensive. And that's why it's going to be really important that we are aware of how that works. So what is inflation? Inflation is gradual increase in the cost of goods and services over time. The keyword gradual. It's one of those things that's like a silent moving mark that we don't really notice it until we stop and look. We don't really notice how things start costing more until we look down at our receipt or whatever it is. And it's gradual over time. And then eventually it starts really impacting things as we're, especially in retirement, more so in retirement than it is when we're working. If we're looking at historical inflation over the last 20 years, obviously post-pandemic is when we felt a big brunt of it. That is when the supply chains kind of got backed up. You saw the ships sitting in the ocean, waiting to get to shore. And it got to a point where it was at 9.1% at one point. It was extremely high. I think we all knew what inflation was. If you didn't know what inflation was, I don't know where you were, because it impacted every part of our lives. And then what the Feds did is they started counteracting inflation by raising interest rates to try to get that back down. The Feds now, what they want is inflation to be stuck in that 2 to 3% range. That's their target. So they have to do whatever they can to get things in that range. But historically, if we're not careful, and we have some periods of time where inflation is high, that can really cause some problems for retirees. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the key worries that people have regarding inflation, especially when it comes to retirees. My staff and myself, we talked to clients, we talked to retirees and said, what worries you the most when it comes to inflation? And we made up a top 5 list. So we're going to talk about what erosion of purchasing power can do over time. We're going to talk about housing and living expenses. We're going to talk about healthcare costs, longevity risk, and investment returns not pacing. So to get into the first one, erosion of purchasing power, let's look at this report as we dive deeper into how that it can impact us at the grocery store. To help illustrate how inflation impacts us over time, I set out on a little recon trip to a grocery store. One of my favorite movies is Home Alone.
Now, there's a scene in the movie where 8-year-old Kevin McAllister goes grocery shopping. Remember, this movie came out in 1990. I recreated a shopping list to see how much it would cost today in 2024. So let's remember what was on Kevin's list. He had a half gallon of milk, a half gallon of orange juice, toilet paper, a TV dinner, bread, frozen mac and cheese, laundry detergent, fabric softener, cling wrap, and toy soldiers.
Are those TV dinners any good?
I don't know.
Let's give it a whirl. For the kids. Hold on, I have a coupon. It was in today's paper.
1983.
Wait a minute. Those are 1990 prices. Let's check out what today's total would be. Today's total would be $45.70 plus sales tax for a grand total of $48.90. So after Kevin's $1 coupon, that makes it $47.90. With prices rising that high, we don't want to say, keep the change, you filthy animals.
That was a fun piece for me to make. One of my favorite movies, especially Christmas time. My daughter will watch it year round now. So, but I still remember how somehow this 8-year-old kid went to the grocery store with a $20 bill and was able to get all that stuff. And then thinking about it now, there's no way you could do that today, of course, because things just cost so much more. And I still think it's kind of funny too. Like he got saran wrap and fabric softener, which it's kind of funny to think about 8-year-old doing that. But you can see what happens over time, though. The erosion of your purchasing power, that $20 is not going to cover even half of that anymore. So that is where that can really have a big impact. Now, over the bigger scheme of things, obviously, because that was a small grocery bill, you can see how that can really amplify, and it's a big concern for retirees. They want to make sure they can still maintain their quality of life, the same life that they had when they were working, or similar when they first retire. They don't want to have to take a pay cut or downgrade anything, and so that is where that's a really major concern. Now, housing and living expenses. Obviously, this is one of the big ones. Obviously, if you look back at the last 20 years, the average home price in the United States was $140,000. Now, just last year was $340,000. It's a pretty big increase. And if you look at the graph, obviously, starting in 2012, so the last 12 years, it's been just on a huge trajectory up. And, we've saw that with the housing market where houses were selling sight unseen without inspection and things like that. Now the market's starting to come back down, but you can see how, people were getting priced out of the market. And then the thing that really impacted this as well from a retiree standpoint was because the interest rates got increased to counteract inflation. To get a 30-year mortgage, you're looking at 7.5% possibly for a 30-year mortgage. Well, 7.5% on a $340,000 house is dramatically different than a $340,000 house at 3%, which is what it was a couple of years before that. And what was happening is people were becoming house poor. I always joke, you can't eat your house. So if something comes up and you need some money for something in retirement, you don't want to be so house poor that you have no way to access any other funds. You can't just decide you're going to take off part of the roof and say, okay, now we're good for a little bit. So that's where you have to be really careful when it comes to housing. And it's not just mortgages, it's also, rentals. Rentals were really high as well. Healthcare costs, obviously, as we age, we're going to have more healthcare needs. But that's one of the big ones, especially. They say the average couple, there's a Fidelity study that said the average couple should plan on spending at least $300,000 in retirement for healthcare alone. And that could be bigger for some people too, if they have some health issues or depending on when they retire. If they have a longer retirement, maybe that's a bigger number. So that could be something that could be a big worry as well. And now healthcare costs, they're rising at a rate of 5 to 6%, which is almost double what the general inflation is. So that is where it's really eating up retirement funds, because now it's costing so much more for medical expenses. And that's where things are really causing some issues when we get to retirement. So what's causing those increased inflation in the medical side? Prescription drugs are costing more. I know this in my own family. I have a family member who the drug costs are outrageous. I can't even imagine how anybody could actually afford that. Hospital services, if you have to be get any kind of medical care at all, and it's something that you can't cover all of it. You could all of a sudden now put your retirement at risk from that. Medical insurance premiums, when you're in retirement, that's usually Medicare. That's where those start going up. Every year you get an update that your Part B is going to change, and that comes right out of your Social Security automatically. But then you also have to be aware of which plan you're on when you're in Medicare. Is it Medigap or is it a Medicare Advantage? And what costs are those going to be as well? So you have to be aware of how that can impact you then too. Now, people are living longer, which we're going to show you in a moment here too. And the longer we live, the more likely we're going to have some medical expenses as well. And partly that's because of healthcare advances. We know so much more. We're able to have more knowledge about how to be healthy, but also we have better technology to keep us, ticking, so to speak. Now, one of the new pandemics we're hearing about down the road is going to be healthcare, though, because we kind of got a glimpse of it during COVID, where we saw that there's a lack of healthcare facilities and workers, but there is a huge number of people that are going to need care. And what's going to happen is that's going to cause a supply demand issue, and it's going to cause the costs for medical care to go up even more and more. And it's going to make it really expensive for the everyday person to get healthcare. Longevity risk. That's the one we kind of hinted at the beginning. We want to make sure that we can cover our needs. So the average life expectancy in 2024 for men is 76, for women is 81. I always joke, my wife is correct here. She's going to outlive me. Women usually outlive men. If you go back even further, 1974, men were living till 67, and then women 75. So you can see how that's increased. Now, these numbers took a tick back recently because of COVID, but you can see we're living longer and longer. And with all the baby boomers coming into retirement now, we have so much more people that are in the medical system then as well. So what's causing some of the concern with longevity? Well, let's look at retirement income and how that grows. And then we're going to compare that to retirement expenses and how that grows. Now, Social Security, every year, if you're on Social Security, you get a cost of living adjustment. And they're projecting it to be under 3% for next year right now. That's projection. Historically, for the last 20 years, it's been 2.63. Now, you're going to see in a moment, too, how that compares to our expenses. But there's a lot of people in retirement that this is a majority of their retirement income. And that could be concerning, especially if you're not making informed decisions about when to start Social Security, because maybe you take a haircut in terms of starting it early, and it's not as much as it could have been if you waited a little longer, if you had some more information. Now, private pensions, a lot of those are going by the wayside. Those are endangered species right now. But if you happen to have a private pension, most of those do not have a cost of living adjustment on them. So basically, if you have $1,500 a month, you're going to have $1,500 a month for pretty much for life. And public pensions, if you happen to be one of those that has a public pension, good for you. It's a great income source. And those do have some cost of living adjustments. Usually it ranges between 1% to 3%, depending on what type of pension it is and where. But it is one that does have some inflation to it. Now, retirement expenses inflation, let's look at that. Now, historically, inflation is around 3%. That's where they want it to be. Now, we just showed you on this previous screen that Social Security was 2.63. Public pensions were zero. Private pensions were zero and public pensions were 1 to 3. So those sources alone are really not keeping up with inflation. And then you add in housing, 5 to 7%, healthcare, 5 to 6%, groceries and food, which we saw with Kevin McAllister and myself, 2 to 4%, and energy costs 2 to 5%. So those are growing more than our income sources. And that's very concerning, which is why you really have to have some really, really good income planning when it comes to retirement to make sure you're accounting for these different things. And as one of my friends says, the math doesn't math. It doesn't add up. If you have income sources that are either not growing or growing minimally, and you have expenses growing at a much higher level, even if you are covering your needs at first, it's not going to last long. And we're going to show you what that looks like in a second. But that's where things can quickly go sideways if you're not careful. So I want to give you a glimpse of some of the software that I use to help my clients and retirees with retirement income planning. And this is I know it's a lot of numbers. I'm just going to point out quickly just so you can see what we're looking at. We're going to assume here that Joe and Sally clients, they both have pensions and Social Security and some minimal assets. So most of their income is coming from those fixed income sources. Their pension is not going to grow at all. It's a private pension. Their Social Security, we're assuming 2.75%, which is probably a bit more than it is normally, but that's what we have on the assumption here. And then expenses growing at 3.27%. So if we look down here, when they first retire, they have a combined pension of $2,300, but because it doesn't have any inflation, it's a flat amount going on year by year. Now their Social Security, they have the two Social Securities in here. It is growing at 2.75. So you can see how that grows minimally over here. And if we add up those two sources, here's our net monthly income. Now versus our net monthly expenses, if you see the green here, that means, hey, we're good. We have more income than we have expenses. Looks pretty good. We're doing well. Now, remember, though, those expenses are growing at 3.27%. So you can see how that, that quickly starts changing as the years go on. So the first 10 years or so, Joe and Sally are doing okay. But let's look at after that first 10 years. So then we get into the second part here, and you can see immediately that we have some red. What happened? What happened is those monthly expenses, the inflation, that silent, that quiet, gradual increase over time is now going to cause your expenses to be more than your income sources. So then what do? That is where a lot of people are stressed and concerned, and they don't know what to do. So then you have to start pulling from your assets, your 401k and your IRAs and things like that. And that's where that has to be extremely important as well, because if that's not managed well, or if it's not still growing and things like that, that's where then you don't have that extra source of income to help offset these differences. So let's look at another scenario. And this is a realistic scenario. I just showed you that men, live till age 76. So in this scenario, we're going to have Joe leave us at age 76. So what happens in this scenario then with that inflation concern? So you can see their pension income. When we get down to age 76, his $1,500 a month pension drops off because he didn't do survivorships. Okay. His Social Security income, you'll see here, when he passes away, Sally's Social Security will drop off because she'll keep the bigger of the two. And you'll see that drop off right here then. So here's our net monthly income. We're starting off pretty good. We're meeting our needs. We're comfortable. We're happy. But then when Joe passes, look at that big difference right here. We go from being $200 a month of excess income to now Sally is about almost $3,300 a month in the hole per month of covering her needs. That's a pretty big deal. And so how is Sally going to make that up? And you can see over here, obviously there's not enough assets to make it work. So then now her retirement takes a big different look going forward. So that's why this inflation is so important to understand when it comes to retirement income planning. The last one, investment returns not pacing. So we kind of touched on if we start not having enough income, then we're going to have to start pulling from that pile of money from IRA, 401k, Roth, things like that. So let's talk about what happens if we have to start pulling from there and some of the risks that can have. So when you're working, first of all, let's talk about what that means. When you're working, our goal is growth oriented. We're trying to grow that money down the road so we can use it for income in retirement. The goal of that is to be compounding. Compound interest is a miracle where your money starts growing and then it it grows interest, and then the interest starts creating interest on top of that as well. And over time, your money starts making more money than you do. And that's how this really works. So you can have enough money for retirement. The goal of saving when you're working is accumulation. We just want to accumulate. If the market's down, it's okay, because now we're buying on discount, like it's Black Friday. We get to buy more shares of our investments at a lower cost when the markets are down. So it's okay. Our risk tolerance when we're working is more risky because we have a longer time horizon. And if you think about it, when we're working, our monthly paycheck is covering our monthly needs right now. So we don't need this money. And so I'm going to show you how that can actually work in retirement too. But our risk tolerance is different. So then when you get to retirement, we have to have a shift. We can't be the same way in retirement. And that's where I see a lot of people fail, because they're still at the same mindset that they're doing when they're working. But now they're in retirement and things have to change. We have to use different skills. We have to use different tools than we did when we were working. And now we have to make some changes. So when you're retired, now it's about income generation. Now we have to turn that pile of money into monthly income, and then make sure it can last throughout retirement, and also make sure it lasts for that other surviving spouse as well. It's about capital preservation too. We can't take the same kind of risk we did when we're 45. 45-year-old retiree, or 45-year-old Joe and Sally is different than 65 and 75-year-old Joe and Sally. If the market goes down, 20% for a year or two, when you're working, it's okay, because it's going to come back and we have plenty of time yet before we retire. But when we're in retirement, we might not ever get that money back. The average retirement's about 22 years. And if we have a 2008 happen, it might take 10 years to get that money back. And that's if you didn't touch the money, which you're going to have to touch the money because you need it for income, or the IRS will make you take it out. So that's where that can really impact things. Again, we have to be careful about inflation protection, making sure it's growing to outpace inflation. And our risk tolerance is going to be a little bit different. It's not going to be what it was, when we're working. So it's going to be a little bit different. We have to make a little bit a change on how we're allocated. We have to make a change on how much exposure we have. And we have to be careful, because sometimes if you do this wrong, it can work bad both ways. What we see a lot of times in retirement, we see people with two extremes. We see the race car and the horse and buggy. The race car obviously is the person that is still doing the accumulation type thing in retirement, where they're just like taking all the risk. They're riding the roller coaster. They're going up and down, but they're not being careful. And if they happen to time things at the wrong time, like if you're trying to retire in 2008, things aren't going to work so well. Then we see the horse and buggy people, which are the people who are like, hey, I am not taking any more risk in retirement. I'm going to just put money under the pillow, or I'm going to, put it under the mattress, because I can't afford to take any risk. The problem is then they're not growing with inflation. And what happens is over time, their money is going to start being valued less, and they're going to have less to cover their needs for retirement then. So these are two extremes. We don't want to be on either side, really. We want to have some sort of comfort in the middle based on your needs. And we'll talk about what that can look like. So let's look at a case study. I'm going to show you Robert. This is a fun story because I met Robert about 6-7 years ago. I was actually out meeting some people in the neighborhood. We had a small conversation. He was like, hey, I'm good. I already retired. I got everything I need. I don't need your help. I'm like, okay, that's cool. And so we just kind of sat there and chatted, and he was, talking about how hot the weather was. He took my business card, and then that was it. And a couple years after that, I get a phone call from him, and he's like, hey, do you remember me? And I'm like, yeah, I do actually. And he's like, well, I actually kept your card this entire time. It was on my refrigerator. I need your help. And the pandemic hit him hard. Inflation really got out of control, which really impacted him. And the markets, there were some big movements in the markets, which really impacted him. And he's like, hey, I screwed up. I need your help. I don't know if I can fix this, but I need your help. So again, he retired at age 60. He's now at this point in time, he's 67. He was living off of Social Security and pension income. So when he retired, he's like, yeah, I have enough income to meet my needs. I'm good. And he was heavily invested in risky stocks. What I mean by risky is he was not diversified. He had during the pandemic, he had a lot of exposure in airlines and oil companies. And if you know anything about what happened during the markets then, they did not do well. And so he lost a significant amount of his savings in his IRAs and taxable accounts because of those particular stocks. And when I met him, he was still holding on to those, hoping they would rebound. But obviously, things don't come back as fast. And so he was like, I don't know what to do. And inflation was really hurting him, like I said, because his income sources were not covering his needs. So here's kind of what his situation was. He needed $3,800 a month to make things work. His income sources, Social Security, he started that early because he retired early, $1,900 a month. And then he had his pension, which is $1,000, and a small annuity for $400. So he had $3,300 a month of income, and he needed $3,800. Now, he was really worried too, because his condo, it was expecting the HOAs, property taxes, and insurances to dramatically increase. So he knew that this was going to get even worse. And so he was like, hey, Kurt, I don't know what to do. I took a big hit in the market, so I don't have as much to tap into anymore. And I'm also worried because these things are going to get worse. And I'm thinking about maybe downsizing. But the problem is I can't even downsize because I'd be almost a lateral move at this point. So I don't know what to do. You see his investments here. Those were significantly more a couple years before that, before the markets took a big chunk out of him. So he was really worried about what to do. And so what we had to do is we had to come up with a plan for him. And he was actually 67. He was okay. He's like, hey, I'm okay doing some consulting work. I wouldn't mind doing that to keep me busy. Plus I need some more money. So what we did is we came up with a plan that basically that his income would just $500 a month or whatever it would cover what he needs now. And we want to save the rest and just save. And then we're going to keep evaluating and get us to a point where we can maybe cover some more income and then start growing and his other stuff back. And then we actually ended up deciding that it didn't make sense for him to move at that point because the market was not favorable with the real estate prices and everything too. So he decided he was not going to do that then. So for you, if you're listening to this about inflation, saying, what should I do about inflation? So here's what we got to do. We got to make sure that you diversify your taxation. If you have all your money in taxable or tax deferred accounts, it's not all yours. It's part of it's going to be Uncle Sam's, and how much of that's going to be, it remains to be seen. So we need to start diversifying our taxation so that way when we do need income, hopefully we get to have more of that and less go to Uncle Sam. When you get to retirement, you have to give your money a job. Some of that money has to be for income. Some of it has to be for growth. Some of it's for immediate needs. You have to give your money a job, though. And that's where I see a lot of retirees fail because they don't do this part, and it's really important. Solidify your paycheck. You got to make sure you have enough income coming in monthly. And then once you do that, then we can start growing money for down the road. And so we always talk about paycheck, playcheck. If you have enough your income coming in and get that covered, you actually can take a little bit more risk and grow more with your paycheck money then, so that we have some more for down the road. Make sure before you do your Social Security and pension decisions that you're getting help and looking at it from all sides to make sure you understand the implications of your decisions so that you don't shortchange yourself in any way. And make sure you understand, the inflation impact on these income sources as well. And then when you start taking money out of your accounts, make sure you're doing it with a sustainable withdrawal strategy. What we see a lot of times, when people first retire, like, hey, I'm going to have some fun and I'm going to go get this toy and get a new car and blah, blah, blah. The problem is, if we're not careful, we start spending more than we should, and we take out money at the wrong times too, with like market volatility. And this can get really out of whack quickly. So we have to make sure if we're not taking Social Security, we're delaying it, that we're also careful about how much we're touching our assets as well, or this could really blow up in the end too. Make sure we have a cash reserve for those what ifs. We know that's going to happen. There's the unknowns are going to happen. So when they do, make sure we can do that and weather that. Limit debt. I mean, that's a big one. During the pandemic, what happened is when those interest rates got super high, if you had a credit card, your minimum payments start going up. And if you happen to, there's a lot of people I heard of that got caught in the HELOC or variable rate type stuff when it came to housing, and that could really bite you really bad too. So really be careful with debt. Consider downsizing. Sometimes when you get to retirement, you don't need to have that 4 or 5 bedroom house anymore, because maybe the kids are gone and you don't need all that space, and maybe you're going to travel anyway. So maybe you consider downsizing. Healthcare planning, make sure that you're reviewing your healthcare plans and your prescriptions and everything every single year, because these things change every year, and every fall, that's when you have a chance to review your Medicare plans, your prescriptions, things like that, and make sure that you're doing that, because if you don't, you'll see those medical costs continue to increase. And that's kind of a blind one too, if you're not keeping your eye on the road. And then part-time income. I've actually worked with a lot of people that really enjoy getting out of the house and working part-time, partly for the social aspect of being able to be around other people, but also get a little extra income that can help them with, if they want to take some trips, or just maybe delaying taking money from their accounts so they can grow them more for future years. So some steps you should take right now: evaluate your income streams. Understand what you have. If you're not retired yet, what are they looking like? Understand the implications of if you start Social Security here or there, what that's going to be. Make sure you understand all those things before you actually get into it too deep. Take an inventory of expenses. I can't tell you enough how many people I meet with that I'll say, hey, what is your monthly income need? And they go, I don't know. I have no idea. And I'll be like, is it like 4,000, 5,000, or is it like 7 or 8,000 or 10 or 12? I have no idea. Like they really don't. But it's so important when it comes to income planning, because you have to have a target. And then of course that target moves with inflation, but you gotta know what you really need to have to live comfortably. So what I always tell people is, look back the last month and just see, like, what were you spending last month and different bills and things like that. And then is there anything different that would be, not consistent, or maybe increase, and get a good ballpark number where you're at. So at least we know what we're trying to get to live comfortably. Review the taxation again, because obviously if you have a bunch of money in tax deferred, you don't really get to have all that. So that's not going to be used as income down the road, because you're going to be paying taxes on a big portion of that too. Make sure you're reviewing your investment portfolio for inefficiencies. It could be some tax inefficiency, or it could be, maybe it's not set up correctly. One of the things that happened during the pandemic is when inflation got sky high, they raised interest rates. And when they raised interest rates, that actually greatly impacted bonds in terms of bond funds. So what they do, and we'll talk more about this in future episodes, but what people were doing is to say, hey, I don't really want to be in the market so much, not the horse and buggy approach, but I want to have a little bit more, not as much in the market. They would move to fixed income, which is bond funds. But the bond funds, because interest rates were so high, they have an inverse relationship with interest rates. You were actually moving to a side that actually had as much risk as the stock market. So you're losing, and you didn't have the potential for growth. So the growth was really out of whack there. And again, make sure you're reviewing those healthcare plans every fall, because we're coming up in about a month or so when the next open enrollment is for Medicare. Make sure you're taking time to review it. I wrote an article on Kiplinger. If you want me to send it to you, I can send it to you so you can learn more about some of the things to think about when it comes to the end of the year with healthcare plans. Well, as we do on every show, we want to make sure we're giving a lot of value as we're going through the show, but also we want to make sure we can leave you with something you can take and read on your own time too. And we have a free resource called the Erosion Explained. It's a downloadable resource that can kind of go over a little bit more in detail some of the things we talked about today, as well as some action things for you to check out. We're going to have that link in the show notes, so make sure you take a look at that. Again, request that by going to that link in the show notes so you can get that resource. Again, we want to thank you today for sitting in with me as we talked about inflation. Thank you for going with me to the grocery store as I got to play Kevin McAllister and find out what it was like to shop with that grocery list he had. As you can see, this is something that's very important. So I don't want you to take light of inflation. Make sure you're aware of it. Make sure you're taking some time to get some really good help. If you want our help, reach out to us. All of our socials are listed. Get in touch with me if you want to really just get a good look at your income and your expenses and see, is this going to work or is it not going to math? And we're here to help. Again, remember, we're here live every Thursday, 11 a.m. on the East Coast, 8 a.m. on the West Coast. We're looking for ways to help rescue your retirement from different things like inflation. Join us next week as we continue our journey into rescuing retirees. Until then, thanks a lot. Have a great week.